I'd like to welcome Leesa. She's been developing custom WordPress themes and plugins in agencies as a freelancer for over a decade, specializing in front-end and custom theme development. This combination of experience has led to her to develop a passion for systematic approaches to design and front-end development and programming, away manual work and human error through automated testing. Please everyone give a round of applause and welcome Leesa.
Thank you. All right. Can you hear me okay? Does that work? Sweet. So my name's Leesa Ward. I run a freelance business called EE Design. Today I'm going to talk to you about developing reusable components in custom themes. Start off with a bit of background about myself and why, what led me to this topic and why you should care about it. A little bit about the design part of it, with how do we get to the point of having components, then about components, and then the meat of the talk about component development and testing, some of the approaches and tools that I've been working with, and then just to sum up how I'm starting to put these concepts to use in my own work. Okay, so a little bit of background. I spent about 10 years in agencies, primarily as a developer, a little bit of design, a little bit of full stack, but primarily in the front end, till about 3 years ago when I started my day job in enterprise, also working on web applications, but outside of WordPress. For 15 years and counting, I've been freelancing across the whole spectrum from design, development, and also ongoing maintenance of websites. And I have also done a few stints as a sessional teacher in TAFE and in short courses, which also sort of informs my approach to a lot of things. So the motivation for sort of this work that I've been doing and bringing this talk to you today. So in agency work, often juggling a lot of projects, multiple websites, and working under a lot of time pressure. Whereas my freelance work is a bit more sporadic, but I really focus on efficiency and longevity in my work. But interestingly, there is a lot of similarity in sort of the goals of having a good, solid foundational code base. And a lot of the points of friction are the same. So those of you who work in agencies, you might have a boilerplate for the themes you build. We did in most of the agencies I've worked in. I have my own, and that's really important for pumping out good quality work quickly and with consistency, and especially when you're in a team. And as a freelancer, it means I can get rolling quickly, even if I haven't touched WordPress code in 3 months. And also providing that consistency across my client sites makes everything a whole lot more maintainable. So even being at both ends of the spectrum in terms of pumping out heaps of work versus a little bit of custom work, a lot of the goals for the foundation I'm working from are actually the same. Which is what sort of brought me to how do I actually build this foundation. So I mentioned a big focus for me is longevity. I once had an agency colleague tell me I shouldn't care so much about crafting really reusable and scalable code because, the sites we work on only last a couple of years. I disagree with that. Because as a freelancer, I've had sites I've built and looked after for 10 years. And 2 of the projects I did earlier this year were clients who had come back to me just for a redesign of sites I had built 8 or 9 years ago. And so it wasn't that, their WordPress side of things was not working anymore. It was that they wanted the visual redesign and maybe some new requirements. I'm like, maybe if we build for reusability and scalability, the sites will last longer. Another focus is flexibility, but within certain bounds. So clients expect to be able to edit their sites. They expect to be able to create new pages, but I don't want them to be able to stray too much from the styles I've built. They want those guardrails in place. They don't want to break stuff. It's not just about, I am the designer and you will not break my design. It's good to have those guardrails in place, but also have a suitable level of flexibility. And clients are expecting more and more of that as everyone's sort of become more tech savvy. Everything's, we've got Gutenberg now and all of that. So over the years, I've become really interested in how to build and maintain a really solid but really extendable foundation, which is what brought me into design systems and component-driven development. So our design system is what governs our UI components, things like typography, colors, spacing, proportions, guidelines for imagery, shadows, all of those really foundational things. So like start with, say you've got a new client project, we want to define these things early. Heading and body fonts, font sizes or relative proportion, font weights, colors, accompanying colors, so that you might have your brand colors, but then it's like, what color do I make an error? Something I really struggled with when component-driven development sort of started becoming a thing was the standalone and isolated nature of them, because to me things like global style sheets make sense. Like I shouldn't be redefining what a paragraph looks like all the time. But I've learnt that you can have that, but it should be stripped back to the things that are truly global, which are these sort of things. So if your client doesn't have a style guide or a design system, I really encourage you to create just a basic one, identify what are their brand colors, what are their fonts, all of those sorts of things. And just as a small side note, I really encourage you to give things generic names. So name colors things like primary and secondary, not blue and pink. So save yourself and your teammates the find and replace when you want to copy a component. So there could be a few different starting points. Like say your client might not have a style guide. And you might be the designer, you might not be the designer, you might just be, I might be talking to a room of people who only ever develop. I do a bit of both. So I might have been given a design mock-up. I might have been given a design system style guide documentation. Clients might just have some social media graphics that they've done themselves or some print collateral. Maybe they only have a logo. And so we need to use those building blocks and come up with those really foundational things as our first step. So this client, for example, had quite active on social media, came to me for a website, took some like, okay, what are the fonts, colors and everything that they're using in their social media? And that became that one. This client came to me having already done a design, and so I had to pull out from that, what are these foundational design tokens? And it became this one. And then this client just had a logo. And so obviously their primary brand color is the pink, and so then it became, well, what font is that, and what other, should we use another font with it? Which colors should we pull out of the paw print versus finding things that just complement the pink? And that became that one, which we'll be launching soon. All right, so if you're already going to be using Gutenberg blocks, then you'll already have a lot of this in your theme.json format, which is great. But if you're not doing that, then putting it in your own format is fine. But I do encourage you to put it in JSON format. That's what I started doing, so I don't even write these sort of files from scratch anymore. I generate them from JSON. I like to automate things. And so once we have that foundation, we can start putting components together that will build our themes. So I'm going to, at various stages throughout this talk, I'm going to be putting up some definitions just so that we're on the same page as to exactly what I mean when I talk about a particular thing. So component, for example, is a super generic term. And if you're from the JavaScript world, you might think React component, but whereas if you're a backend developer, you might think of something totally different. So for today, component, a general term for any user interface element that is packaged up for distribution. So in our case, it's any UI element that's in a theme. They could be made up of other components, but it becomes more of a pattern. They could be React components if that's how you're building your front end. Then what I'll be showing you today isn't. It's more your traditional HTML and PHP. They could be as small as headings and buttons up to things like banners and accordions. Your Gutenberg blocks, I would consider each of those a component. Likewise, if you use advanced custom fields, flexible content, for my examples using that, then those are components as well. But then how do we break down or build up our designs in this component-driven way? Because often our issue is, clients are not looking for components. Clients are still looking for web pages. And so often that is what we design. So this one, for example, was one before I started doing some of the things I'm going to talk about later, I designed this website. And so then I had to break it down to build it. So this is not an exhaustive list of all the components, but to give you a good idea of what I'm talking about when I say component, we've got the site header, page header, we've got a button, we've got the event card, we've got a little date block that's inside the event card that could also be used like on blog posts, things like that. The pagination, that's a component. This call to action, that's a component. And components can have variations. That's one of the main sort of things we're going to be talking about today, testing our variations. And yeah, footer is another one. And so when I talk about reusable components, I'm talking about ones that can be used multiple times throughout a theme, but also in some cases across many themes, because so many things are actually pretty generic at their core. So clients who are paying us for a custom theme aren't necessarily, they're not paying us to find an off-the-shelf theme and shoehorn their stuff into it. They are paying for us to design them something and then build it into a WordPress theme. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to code every single element from scratch just so you can say that it's totally from scratch. So like if you've got 10 other clients that have an accordion or a light box, you probably shouldn't be coding that from scratch. And so that's where this sort of boilerplate code base that I'm going to show you how I'm building up is important. So for example, call to action, there's a couple of variations within this one site, but then like the same sort of concept across multiple of my client sites. So they've just got different styling, add some different options, like some have an image or multiple buttons, things like that. But at their core, they're pretty generic, and so that's something that's reusable across projects, and why we use primary and secondary and things are not blue and pink. And so building on that, a custom theme to myself, my definition, is one that's developed to suit the client's needs and matching the visual design that's been agreed on. So we go, what are requirements and design, and then we code, as opposed to finding an off-the-shelf theme. But I'm also here to talk to you about working smarter, not harder, by building up a library of reusable and extendable components as well. Because you might be thinking, that sounds awful lot like using a template. It's like, it kind of is, but the template on its own doesn't really do anything. It's just your foundation. Because the fact is, a lot of components, there's a lot of common patterns, and it makes sense to use them because people know how certain things work. And yeah, there's a reason that certain patterns are so common. So it makes sense to keep, restyling those same things and across projects. And you're still going to have custom ones, which I'll get to, like that are client specific. But I'm going to talk a bit about today building this really solid foundation. Which brings me to component development and testing. Earlier I mentioned how it's super important now to have flexibility. Clients want to be able to set, one call to action banner to be blue and another to be pink without having to come to me and say, I want one of those but pink. They wouldn't be able to do that. But then we, as the developers or designers, want those call to actions to automatically have the same padding, know whether to use black or white text for color contrast, and all those sorts of things. We want, the client wants to be able to create a call to action, put this content in it. We want to make sure it looks right and it works right, like responsive design and all of that. So I briefly mentioned design tokens or variables, fancy word for variables, that we can put in through our theme.json or block.json or wherever else it might be, depending on the tools you're using. And yeah, so we use all of those. Clients worry about the content. Fast forwarding just a little bit, we use those design tokens and page designs, and we build out our components. Great. But we really need to be able to really thoroughly test all the possible different layout and styling combinations and variations that clients can edit in the back end, because that's only increasing, like with Gutenberg. Because it's all well and good when using ACF modules, where it's like you can have an orange one or you can have a green one, and that is what they do. Whereas now clients are rightfully expecting more flexibility, and there's inner blocks to worry about as well, and that sort of thing. And so we need to really thoroughly test those. Not like this time when I used semi-transparent backgrounds on my alert boxes and one of them ended up on a navy blue background. We do not want things like this ending up on live websites. Fortunately, it was me who did that, and I realized pretty quickly, whereas a lot of my clients, if they then did that, they would be freaking out and going, oh, how do I fix this? What have I done? I can't read it, and they'll come to me to fix it. We don't want that to happen to start with. We want to really thoroughly test all and make sure every option that they have actually looks and works nicely. So some of the ways we can do that, we could build a ton of test pages. That's tedious, manual, and prone to human error. I don't like that. We can programmatically find usages in a site. I did that in one of my previous agency jobs. We used advanced custom fields, flexible content modules. It was sort of when Gutenberg was still super young, we had not adopted it. And I went through all the pages and found a use of each module and output that on a page. But at scale, that becomes really inefficient. That page is massive, takes ages to load and process that. And it might not actually capture every variation. It's only the ones that are currently in use. So today I'm going to share with you the approach I'm currently working on, which is using a dedicated tool for UI development, separating, to an extent, the UI layer from the data layer. So it involves loading each component independently with demo content and using a tool called Storybook to give us that enhanced environment. So they call it a front-end workshop for building UI components and pages in isolation. It's open source. I should say I'm not affiliated with Storybook in any way. I just genuinely think it is a really good tool. You might have come across it in sort of if you work with React or sort of JavaScript projects. That's where I came across it initially. But there are also lots of add-ons you can get, such as one I'm using to load PHP pages and end up with something like this for my development and testing environment. So, this is a call to action, for example, and some of the options are available, and I can click through those and see all the different combinations. Benefits of that, we can test all the variations and combinations of settings really easily. We can get component level feedback from the designers if they're not ourselves, and they also provide living documentation of all the components in the theme. So for example, if you or someone else comes back to this in a year's time to build a new page, you can easily see what all the components that are available are without having to sort of go in and test and build a page and go, oh, what does that one do? You can see it. And then you're not going to, write duplicate code that doesn't need to be written. Like some of the longer term sites that I worked on in some agencies, which went through a few different people, they ended up with some really, really similar content modules, because instead of like using what was already there, because they maybe didn't know, people would come in and build a fresh new module that was 80% the same. And so, that's one of the things we can do. And on showing it to the designer, and they can provide that component level feedback, they can potentially identify issues that we haven't seen, any other variations that should be there. Maybe they want to rein us in and say, they shouldn't be allowed to do that combination, and that sort of thing. And rather than them going through the whole site design and maybe, pointing something out that in multiple places, which is actually the same thing. So that can be really efficient as well. So what we need to actually get this working, this is the technical part. This is going to be quite high level because we're obviously on a time limit today. But all of my examples and everything I'm going to continue working on, it's all up on GitHub. So if you do want to check it out in more detail, as what you see today and also what I keep working on. So what we'll need a local PHP installation. We need our components broken up into standalone files because we're doing isolated testing. You still might have like one global style sheet that you apply as well for like, this is what heading ones look like. But other than that, everything nice and broken up. And we need a way of loading just the component file and have it display in the browser with some data. So you might need to make some slight adjustments to how your code is organized for this sort of to work. Here's some of my folder structures, for example. One's an advanced custom fields one, and one is block-based, but it's quite similar in that each thing has a folder, has a styling file, has a PHP file for its output. Some of them might have some JavaScript. And then, so I've written a little script that will start myself up a PHP server. Also, you can find that on GitHub. And so then we've got a little web server running on our machine. And then I set up some symbolic links from my real theme folders to where I'm working in Storybook, because I don't want to copy and paste all my changes. That's crazy talk. And that makes it nice and easy to work on and for the server to also find those files. And my script also adds a file at the top and bottom of each file to make it a proper valid HTML document. So it adds, your HTML, your body, your head tags, and that's where I also load in those style sheets and everything. And then I can load my component as a standalone thing. Now, initially it doesn't work because WordPress is not there. So it's loading that file. So yay, it's loading the file. But it's not actually displaying anything yet because like in this example, it doesn't know what get subfield means. That's an ACF function. And then this one, which is a Gutenberg block that I've just wrapped the block in my own wrappers, I get a white screen because it's first checking if there is a block set, and there's not because this is, the file completely out of context. And so if I remove that check, it doesn't know what render block means, it doesn't know what apply filters means, and all of that. So we need a way to tell it what that means. And there's a few different ways that we can do that. If the code that it's looking for is class-based, you could extend the class and just override the bit that provides the data, because we don't have a database. We just want some basic examples of what these things do because we're working on the UI. For single functions, we can just define our own version, which is a lot of what my examples do today. If you want to import a file that has a bunch of functions, but then you want to redefine one of them, that can be a problem because it won't let you redeclare. And there's some techniques you can do with that, or you can combine them. So how I've been doing it, this example here uses advanced custom fields, which is where get subfield comes from. It also has some inbuilt WordPress functions, WP attachment image and WP auto P. But calling the real functions doesn't make any sense because there's no database, there's no real context. So I could tell it, hey, there's the definition of get subfield, but where's it going to get subfield from? So I just, and so very similar with WP get attachment image. I'm separating this from the data layer, so I've just got an example. And so how I do that is I look at what functions does it call, understand what each function does, and importantly what it returns, what's it going to actually output in my UI, because that's the layer I'm concerned with here. Consider what the essential parts are. Like, is the main thing that it returns an image, or is there some stuff it's doing to the image in there that I want to test as well that will impact my approach? And work out the best way to mock those results and get that example data in there. And so here's an example for WP get attachment image. The real function's not loaded because I'm just loading this PHP function, a file, template part, on its own. So I'm telling it to return this image. This is a really simplified example, but I can also pop conditions in there to handle the different image sizes that are in my theme and have them be output into this standalone thing so I can test it and make sure it all works, independently of any particular website. Cool. Slightly more complex example, I mentioned extending classes earlier. So I had like this breadcrumbs plugin that I wrote, and so I went through and went, where do the actual breadcrumbs get set? And just overrode just that method and went, instead of grabbing them out of this non-existent database, to just give it the breadcrumb structure, and then the rest of the file does all the same processing, the same everything that it would in a real website. And so to get the technical terms for those sort of concepts, dependency injection, which is where we give it that piece of the puzzle that it needs rather than it creating it or grabbing it from the database. And the other one you might see is monkey patching, which is where we've imported something and we just actually want to patch up just that function or something like that. And instead of using that definition, keep the rest of the file the same. But yeah, super high level overview. But that's another tab, that technical setup stuff. That's not the real fun part. Let's get into that. Which will also make it a lot clearer why I'm sort of doing it this way with this isolate the component and fake the functions, and you're thinking, why? So we're going to have a bit more of a look at Storybook here. So for example, I have this call to action component. It's loaded standalone, not even in Storybook yet, because I've done my own version of get subfield that's, mimics what happens in a real site. And that's now loaded by my little PHP server. Cool. But like I mentioned earlier, what I really want out of this is I want to test all the variations, all the combinations of options that clients will be able to choose from when they're using this in WordPress. So that's where the real power of Storybook really comes in. Add our components as options as controls in Storybook, and that provides us with this on-the-fly testing environment where we can go in and choose and test and play and refine as we're coding and that sort of thing. So how we do that, we define a story file, which when using the Storybook for Server, which is an add-on we need to be able to do with PHP files, we need to use a JSON format. I just wanted to call that out because a lot of the examples you find online for Storybook are for JavaScript and they use a different format. All the fields are the same, it's just the format. The most important part being the argument types, because that's what aligns directly to what is in WordPress in the CMS. So if it's a block, it might be things like the block supports background colors and here are the backgrounds in from thing.json. That corresponds directly to that. If it's advanced custom fields, you save your ACF JSON, it needs to correspond exactly to that. If you're using some other page builder, as long as you can export something in JSON, you could probably make this work. And so, yeah, we just need to translate that. I've written a script for that as well. I like to automate things. And then those things become available in the interface as controls. And then, so you're wondering, how would we make those controls actually make the change live, like we saw a moment ago? How does that actually work? If we have any sort of old school PHP developers in the house, they're in the URL. So we can use a good old-fashioned request global and grab the parameters out of the URL. So in that fake function, so here's my fake get subfield function, it just goes, instead of looking in the database for what the background color is, it just looks in my Storybook URL. And so every time I click a different control, that URL will change slightly, and it grabs that out and uses that as this fake version of the function. So it just mimics what would really happen, just without any real data or anything, just as a standalone thing. Cool, so yeah, and I told it to use my version of get subfield and gets the options, the values out of that URL. I pretty much already said all that. So that is so we don't have to go and create a whole lot of test pages for every client. We don't need to set every variation and make sure everything is manually covered. We can process all of those definitions from JSON, find what are all the options, and put them all in there all automatically, and then we can have a play and we can test and all of that as we develop our theme. But you're probably thinking, no, it all looks great and all, but it also looks extremely tedious to set up. And you know, maybe your projects have so many differences in components that would never end. Yeah, I hear you, I don't like tedious things, but I like automating things. Fortunately, I love to automate my way out of tedious and repetitive work. And because everything is in JSON, even sort of things that I used to just put straight into my styling, I now put into JSON, which turns into styling, we can convert one JSON format to another format. So if you're using a block theme, you've got your theme.json and your blocks have your block.json. If you're using advanced custom fields, that all saves itself as JSON as well. There are ways to get from JSON to Sass for styling, like I mentioned. So, that's just a little step, but I'm like, if I don't have to do it, I'm going to just define everything in one place and roll. And so, yeah, we just need to be able to convert that format to the story format, which I've written a script which works for most of the ACF modules that I've set up so far. And I will be also doing one for blocks, just isn't ready for today, unfortunately. So this is just a quick screenshot of part of it where it goes through and goes, what type of field is this? Okay, and then what does that translate to in Storybook? And also working on, and also partly working for some things, is auto-generating the mock functions themselves and the mock data. So for that, like get subfield example, if I quickly go back there, where it can go, okay, you have a text field, here's a sentence that you can use to test this place where a sentence goes. And just random generated and popped into that JSON. So we don't have to go and set up data, we don't have to set up the real client site, or even like a demo site, and we don't need a WordPress site at this point. We can just go, this is the type of data I need, here is an example of that data, and we put that into the story. Cool. And some of the things that I didn't have time to go into in detail today, but some of the other things that we can do with this sort of Storybook environment. Accessibility testing, because we we can set up every variation, and we can run some of the tools that Kitty spoke about earlier today, about like contrast and document structure and all of that. We can run them against our standalone versions of each individual component. We can run visual regression tests, which are really good on bigger websites where it will compare the old to the new. And so if you've gone and made a small change, it will then hopefully tell you if an unexpected change has occurred in another component. And also component testing, so you can bring, so like for the actual like interaction and stuff like that, you could bring in integration and end-to-end testing tools and things like that. To test things like, does the accordion open and close when you click it? Does the mobile menu with the hamburger, does that open when you expect it to? So tools like Playwright and Cypress you could bring in, because it's just a web page at this point. Each component is just a web page. It's running on your PHP server. So anything that you can run, any test or anything you can run on a web page, you can now run on your components. All right, so a bit of a summary of, so I've talked a lot about the pros. No need for a running website or a real database. We're focused completely on UI development and focusing on that reusability element. We've got consistent development and testing materials, so it's not at the whim of the client going changing the content or those sort of things. Once it's set up, it's easy to test all the variations and share that with clients, collaborators, designers and so on. Another pro is it lowers the barrier to entry for front-end developers who are joining the project. So I mentioned earlier I've done a bit of teaching, that sort of colours my view as well. It's like, how do I get my students who I'm teaching HTML, CSS and these basic PHP things where they put some stuff in a database and go, ooh, how do we transition from that to them building custom WordPress sites? Like there's a big disconnect where they think WordPress is just this thing where we point and click our blocks, and they don't, there's a big gap between that and what they've learned how to code. And this sort of setup goes, okay, well, here's these components with here's some HTML, there might be a little bit of JavaScript. I need you to add this feature, or I need you to change the styling. And because they're just working on that one little piece, that's going to help them ramp up. And then they'll be able to look into the PHP and go, oh, okay, that's where that's getting that out of WordPress. And I think can really help people on board into your project. And like I mentioned a moment ago, automated testing possibilities. But I will acknowledge there are some cons and caveats. It does require a bit of effort and expertise to set up, particularly like around creating the mock functions and understanding how WordPress works under the hood and how everything is output to be able to fake it. You could easily fake things too much because we're basically just replacing one function with another that outputs something, so it's not actually testing what the function does, it's just the output, which, that might be all we need, but it's really important to be aware of that caveat. So it's limited to just testing the look and feel rather than like full user journey. So like if you're trying to test like a WooCommerce, checkout journey, this probably isn't the tool, because if we were to fake all of that, it's not actually testing what we want. But if we want to test what the cart looks like and that, that hovering over something shows a tooltip and things like that, that's what this sort of tool works. And so to sum up how I bring that all together, how I'm putting this to use in some of my projects I'm working on at the moment. Step 1, style guide. Design tokens, variables, those foundational building blocks for this particular site, the fonts, the colors, all of that. The key components, the layouts, the page designs, if they haven't already been provided. And there might be a bit of back and forth as you design it, depending on what your client already had ready. Versus what you're needing to create, you might go back and forth between those. There might be some parts of your style guide that you won't really know until you try to build the site. So it might be a bit of those. Then I go and compile those initial assets, so my Sass to CSS and all of that, and then look at what my common components look like with the client's branding and all of that, and make any adjustments to those. Then, I build custom themes, and we're just going to be like, yes, everyone can have this cookie cutter template. It's like, no, we're going to add to that. We're going to put icing on top of the cookie. So next step will be generate the theme code for this particular project's custom components. So they've got some other blocks, then I need to make their block.json and the files that render those blocks. If I'm using ACF, then I do go into WordPress at this point to create those fields and make sure that's all set up. And do I need a JavaScript file? Get all of that set up for the custom ones. Then generate those stories using my script that converts from that JSON, whether it's ACF JSON, block.json, whatever, into a story and those mock functions, so that then I can now look at my new ones that are just for this client in Storybook and continue the development, testing, styling, and so on in my Storybook environment. And the last one, at least, profit. Then once we've got that really solid base for this particular theme, that's when we log into WordPress and we actually build out the pages. And we can be confident then that all the possible combinations have been tested, and we can look at them at any time in Storybook. And that if the client goes in there and chooses some options that we maybe didn't expect them to, that we have accounted for that in our development process. Last but not least, just a few resources. The top one there will take you to my GitHub repo that has all the examples, everything you've seen today, and I'll be continuing to add to that. Some of the key tools, obviously Storybook itself, Storybook for Server add-on that we need. I compile all my CSS and everything using Gulp, which we didn't get a new version for 4 years. Everyone probably thought I was crazy, but version 5 came out, so I stand by that. And there is a Gulp plugin you can get to do JSON to Sass, so I can go, here are my variables in JSON, and then it will give me a Sass file. That's very exciting to me anyway. And so I can then quickly compile all of those assets once I go, here's this client's foundation, recompile everything for those foundations. For the monkey patching sort of approach to bringing in the real functions and patching them up, there's a tool I came across recently called Patchwork that I found really easy to get started with. And if you're generating mock content, there's a couple of suggestions there of where you might get that. Cool. I hope I've covered everything, because this is my last slide. You can find me on GitHub and my website as well. And happy to have a chat.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Leesa? Okay. One question.
Thank you, Leesa. Very informative, and it's good to see that we've both been knocking on, I guess, the same door with some automated testing. In your theme, you structure out your components so that you have your Sass, JavaScript, and your PHP in one place, which is great. It gives you that functional component kind of development style. Have you considered taking the PHP functions that are specific to WordPress out of the template and into something that translates that data that needs to be provided to what could be a purely functional component?
Yeah, a little bit. So how this sort of idea originally started was I was in my day job, shouldn't put that in quotation, but I have another full-time job, full disclosure, is I work with React. And so I was, looking at building out, my own library of React components. And for some of my personal projects, I like to use Vue. And I was like, how might I build a component library that can use across all these platforms? And I was like, how would I put WordPress components into Storybook? How would I make this work? So the short answer is yes, I have given some thought to that, especially after Zach's talk this morning with MVC. There was a level of abstraction there and I thought was really interesting and played into that same idea. I just haven't done it at this point because this work's sort of become quite specific to me building custom themes for clients. And so, yeah, that's why. And like a big key thing for me to make this concept work is not to edit those template parts at all. That's why I like the symlink to the real file rather than any kind of copying and pasting. There shouldn't be any code in the actual template partial that WordPress is going to load that is only there for Storybook. so it should be standalone. But what you've just described would also work with that as well, yeah. And then I would have a test version of it. So you'd have like the one that interacts with the database, and then there'd be like a version of that that has all the same methods with the fake data. And I think that could be a really good way to go about it, yeah.
Hello. One thing you said that I really resonated with was there's a massive disconnect between like people who are juniors and learning and coming into the industry, and essentially like what is a giant ecosystem of WordPress. Is there any advice that you could give like someone like me who is a junior, who is kind of now delving into that world, to like better get to a point like this, looking back, I guess, reflecting on your journey and like, you know, pain points or like things that you wish you had known?
Yeah, I think I was kind of lucky in a way in that like React and things like that weren't really a thing. So when I learnt to code, it was HTML and CSS, and then we added some PHP, and that's how we sort of build in WordPress, and it's become more JavaScript. And the challenge I'm finding now is a lot of students who are first learning to code, they're learning JavaScript and React, and like there's a certain segment of that industry that acts like PHP doesn't, you know, no one uses that, or PHP is so uncool. I'm like, no, PHP is actually pretty good, I like it. And then then you're actually hired by like an agency and you're presented with PHP. And so I guess I'd say like, go back to the HTML and CSS, bare basics, and then have a look at how you can use PHP to bring data into those templates. As opposed to trying to like translate, you know, your JavaScript like React or Vue concepts straight into that, because they do work a little bit differently. So sort of, yeah, pairing it back, if that's the sort of background you've come from. If you haven't come from that React background, still, I guess, pretty similar, is making sure your HTML, CSS skills and your sort of basic JavaScript skills are there first, because then it's going to make it a lot easier to start sprinkling in PHP, especially if you're working in WordPress, because I'm like, you don't have to, you know, be a back-end developer to work with a bit of PHP. So sort of like your goals as well. Do you want to be a front-end developer, but you need to learn a bit of PHP to be able to work with WordPress or other CMSs? Or do you actually want to be a back-end developer, in which case might have a different answer. Just trying to build something really basic just in plain PHP, just to get a good idea of how it works.
Thank you, Leesa. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We are running into a very short break after this, so if everyone could just give Leesa a round of applause.